time for that at the end. All right, so a little bit of background on this chair. So we are a relatively new UNESCO chair, and again, we're based at Stellenbosch, and our overarching goal is to identify and amplify African voices and perspectives on intercultural competence. And then our three priorities are looking at the intersections of intercultural competence with gender, with climate action, and with peace building. And so you'll find that many of our monthly webinars will be addressing aspects of looking at those intersections. And today we have a wonderful speaker joining us, and we'll be looking at what this intersection of intercultural competence with climate action and sustainability and humans' relation to all beings on this planet look like. So we're really looking forward to the talk today. You will see that there is a core team here at Stellenbosch. And so while I'm the chair holder, I'm also joined by two co-chairs, Dr. Precious Simba and Dr. Divinia Jitu, who Dr. Jitu comes to us from Durban University of Technology. Dr. Precious Simba is an education professor here. And then you'll see our other members of our core team, including Van de Witt, who's here as our operational coordinator, and then our team leads. And the team leads are in each of the areas I just mentioned of our priorities. And so we're very grateful to be able to work together as a team and then to connect with so many of you through networks around the world. You also see our website there where you can go to get more information. So in addition to the research that we are undertaking around intercultural competence here on the continent, we are also involved in capacity building, in particular through UNESCO story circles. Some of you may be familiar with this intercultural methodology that is inspired by indigenous traditions that have existed in many indigenous cultures around the world for centuries. The purpose of UNESCO story circles is to practice key intercultural competencies like listening for understanding, which we don't do often enough as humans, where we really focus deeply and listen deeply to the person speaking, and not interjecting ourselves into the conversation as much. It's a structured yet adaptable methodology that involves circles of 4 to 6 participants, and it can be done in person or online. It's very scalable. We've even done this at conferences with over 1,000 participants, so it's really amazing how impactful it can be in such a short amount of time. And you can find out more about that through the online manual that you'll see there in the websites at the bottom through UNESCO. So with that, that's one of the main pieces we wanted to share with you about our capacity building. We do invite you to join our partner. One of our partners is a global nonprofit called the World Council on Intercultural and Global Competence. It's entirely free to join. You just go to this website, iccglobal.org, complete a brief membership form, and then you'll receive a link to World Council's Linker online platform. And there you will find over 20 different working groups, including a special ICC in Africa working group, which we hope all of you will join. And that working group always holds a meeting a week after our webinar to delve further into the ideas that come from the webinar. So we hope all of you will join us next week during the ICC in Africa working group. Some of our upcoming events. So our next webinar is October 21. Please mark that on your calendar. We hope you'll join us, and that's featuring a speaker, Rhoda Malgus. And then our annual in-person intercultural conference is being held in Rabat, Morocco this year at the end of the month. So we invite, hopefully some of you will be able to see you there, and we'll see you all next month at the next webinar. So that kind of brings me to today's speaker we're really excited about. And to introduce today's speaker, I want to turn this over to my colleague, Yansiwe Mubisa, who is one of our core team members, and she's going to introduce our speaker and then facilitate the Q&A at the end. And we encourage you again to continue and putting introductions in the chat, and then also questions that come up for you. So over to you, Yancy.
Thank you so much, Donna, and welcome to everyone. So lovely to see all of you here today. Really, really excited about today's speaker, who is Prof Nokwanda Makunga from the Science Faculty here at Stellenbosch University in the Department of Botany and Zoology. Now, I'm sure some of you might have read through her bio that we sent out with the invitation for today's session. And you can already see that it's quite a science, technical, heavy based sort of line of work that she's in. But I think what's quite exciting about today's presentation, and just as she shares some of her work, is just her understanding the diversity of plants and their cultural significance, and just making that link between science and society and the needs that we are able to reap from nature. And I think as she speaks some more, we'll also just begin to understand a little bit more about some of the diverse fauna and flora that we have here in South Africa, and how she uses her different scientific methodologies to further understand these organisms and how we can better use them, whether it's for economic viability or even just for cultural significance and for us to enjoy. So I'm quite keen. Prof. Makunga is also quite a science communicator. She's received numerous awards, and I've often attended some of her talks where she really bridges the gap between science and communication. I think as intercultural practitioners that also look at the climate action theme and trying to understand how such technical science can be translated so that they also have such heavy cultural significance and relevance. I think this is the best speaker that we could have had for today. I won't read word for word the rest of her bio, just because it is available for everyone, and I'll also just reattach it in the chat. Instead, I'll, with great honor, like to welcome Prof Makunga and for her to just share a little bit more today. I'm super excited, and welcome, Prof.
Thank you so much, Yenzi. It's wonderful to be here. I'm ready to share some ideas in relation to the kind of work that I do. So I'm going to load up my PowerPoint and hope everybody can see it.
Yes, we can see it. I just put it
Wonderful.
on full screen. There we go.
And everyone is also happy with level of sound.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. This is really a wonderful invitation to have had, and I'm actually quite excited to be part of this webinar. And today I'm going to talk about medicinal plants of South Africa, and I'll highlight a few that I actually work on. And I really want to focus on the balancing act of trying to conduct research in this area that integrates plants, people, and different technologies. So, without much further ado, I just want to remind all of us about this wonderful flora that we actually have in South Africa. I'm sure people are coming from different parts of the world, so I'm going to just really iterate on what a wonderful place this part of the world really is in terms of its biodiversity. And when you look at plant biodiversity, you will see that South Africa is home to several hot biodiversity hotspots, and this includes the Cape Florested region with about 9,000 species. It also includes the succulent Karoo area, and also it includes the Maputo Ponderland Albany corridor. And this is really quite renowned because this part here, the Maputo Ponderland Albany corridor, that stretches all the way along the eastern seaboard of Africa, has quite unique species that are very different to those plants that sit on the western coast of South Africa. And you find some patches of forests along here. You've got plants such as Erythrina afra, and I'm really happy to note that this species was recently changed. I think it's actually been a year now, from Erythrina caffra to Erythrina afra, which in terms of the South African context is much more of an inclusive name and not so derogatory in relation to South African socio-political culture. The wild ginger that I've shown here, wild African ginger, is actually extinct in parts where it's natively found, and much of the harvest for medicinal plants has now, for this particular medicinal plant, has moved to other parts of Africa, including Mozambique. So one has to take into consideration that people need the plants for healthcare, but at the same time, we have to think about conservation issues surrounding those particular plants. And now I want to concentrate on the part of the world that I'm actually physically situated in. That would be the Cape Floristic region. And at this particular moment, I'm actually dialing in from Nieuwoudtville, which is known as the bulb capital of the world. And this part of the world has the largest succulent diversity worldwide. There are unique species that are very iconic and very characteristic of this part of the world, including the quiver trees. And interestingly enough, this is becoming a new model to try and understand impacts of climate on these kinds of species. Some of you might have heard of Hoodia gordonia. It was very popular in the early 2000s. It was going to save everybody from being fat and obese because it was going to be commercialized as a slimming agent. But this particular species is surrounded by some controversy because the commercialization of this species somewhat forgot the indigenous people who actually held the knowledge in relation to Hoodia. And so that got rectified. There were law cases and ultimately beneficiation with the San people who have been the main users of Hoodia, taking the species along with them on long hunts to stave off hunger and appetite. And then the Welwitschers, they occur, of course, in the Namakwaland area, stretching all the way into Namibia. And I think they're really quite interesting plants. They're very old. You got these two leaves that carry on growing indefinitely. And when they flower, they put out interesting floral organs. And they, of course, have adopted and evolved very unique ways in order to be able to live and colonize these very dry areas where they are found. So all of these different species are quite unique, and they are very interesting. And I want to show some of these plants that are actually found here and talk a little bit about these plants as they just roll off. So you'll find that these plants have fascinated natural historians for thousands of years, and they also have been found in all kinds of different environments. The geoclimatic environments where these species are found are thought to be part of the evolutionary cocktail that has ultimately led to the explosion of these different species throughout the Cape Floristic region and parts of the succulent Karoo. And they have evolved very unique strategies where sometimes for many months of the year there's no water, but ultimately the felt will actually explode into color. And this is one of the reasons that I'm actually sitting in Nieuwoudtville at this particular time, is to come and do a little bit of flower watching. Species such as this that I'm showing here are very much integral to the people of the areas where they're actually found. And that history stretches back to the days of the Dutch East India Company And here, Pape was amongst the first people who started to record the plants of the Cape and integrate all the knowledge that he was sourcing from local people and noted down. So he is actually probably regarded as the first ethnobotanical explorer that came to the shores of the Cape. And here there's a quote that I've put down, and this comes from his notes where he said that the local people, the indigenous people, were quite agreeable in their way and that they assisted even with the sick. And this interaction of different cultures that have actually met here in the Cape region dates back many, many, many years. And to the extent that some of South Africa's plants actually found their way already in the 1700s to Europe. And nowadays you'll find South Africa's plants pretty much all over the world because of their horticultural importance. And this, of course, doesn't happen without local people. And when you look at the way in which indigenous knowledge is actually shared in the African context, it's passed on from one generation to another generation through oral histories, and that information in terms of medicinal plants in South Africa is linked to the local culture, which is attached to the San people as well as the Kwekwe people, who are the original people that were hunting and gathering in this part of the world. And here I showcase gladiolus, for example. These are species that have found their way to Europe, and botanical drawings that were done in the 1600s, showcasing some of the Cape bulbs that had been extracted from this part of the world. So there has been some knowledge sharing. There's also been, of course, some exploitation of local knowledge. And this, however, gives us a better idea of how biocultural diversity integrates to plant diversity. And in South Africa, 60 to 80% of the population is reliant on plants for healthcare purposes. We sit with about 4,000 to 5,000 medicinal plant species that are used by different people throughout South Africa. And so that biocultural diversity is exceedingly important. And it is attached to the way in which South Africa's history has actually played out. So you have the European settlers who arrived here, who met up with the Bantu people as well as the Kwekwe and the San people who were here before. And that in itself created new ways of cultural exploitation of plants. That even led to what is known as the Cape Dutch herbal system. But at the same time, the European settlers brought people from Asia, which then means that those Asian cultures also somewhat got infused into this melting pot that was the Cape region or the Cape Peninsula. And so South Africa's exploitation of medicinal plants really showcases biocultural diversity. And any place that has biocultural diversity along with plant biodiversity is a place that has opportunities for economic exploitation. And so this makes for a very interesting place to live and actually study. And now I just want to see if this video is actually going to play. So hopefully we will be able to get onto YouTube without any issues.
The sound is not coming through very well.
Wrenched and perched precariously atop a South African mountain. Well, I'm undergoing a cleansing ceremony with a traditional healer. Traditional healers believe they receive supernatural guidance from ancestral spirits and have been part of Africa's social fabric for centuries. These shamans use traditional medicines and rituals to help improve people's mental health. Healers are vital in Africa, where there's a severe shortage of therapists across the continent. And they're increasingly popular among younger people. But why?
You can go down any street, any corner, and somebody will be able to point you in the direction of a traditional healer.
Well, they're still popular because the people in the community still believe that their methods and their medicines work.
I think that when people go through things that they cannot explain, like a depression or anxiety, they go to the people that they've heard about from their fathers or their grandfathers. They go to traditional healers.
Traditional healers have helped my family and extended family during our time of grieving with cleansing so that we can be hopeful that everything will be okay after our time of grief.
Traditional healers aren't just popular with residents. More and more psychiatrists and psychologists are working with them to improve South Africa's mental health system. Let's find out more. This is Mindset.
So I leave it at that with that particular documentary, but I think it's a very interesting documentary because it actually showcases how traditional medicines are still very much part of South Africa, even in this modern time. And they say, as I mentioned before, about 60 to 80% of the South African population, irrespective of their level of education, still actually utilize medicinal plants as part of their healthcare system. So there are these two different tracts of healthcare, one that is steeped in indigenous knowledge, where you have a high amount of indigenous healers that don't have formal training, who say that they have gotten this knowledge through their ancestors. And on the other hand, you've got a very low amount of medically trained doctors. And so being able to access primary health care means that the indigenous knowledge practice in South Africa actually continues. So that's what really keeps it going. Now I want to turn our eye to looking at a slightly different topic, another intersection, where we are looking at global patterns associated with plant biotechnology versus the South African context. And ultimately, this leads us to look at the intersection of the exploitation of plant biotechnology in studying medicinal plants of South Africa. And one can see from this map here that, yes, plant biotechnology has been important for the last 50 years in the South African context. And you've got certain countries in Africa where their circle is actually much larger. So the exploitation of different plant biotechnology techniques for studying plants as a whole can be taken into consideration. But when you look at where the research is really located, you can see that large amounts of that research is actually sitting in parts of the world that don't necessarily hold the kind of biodiversity that we hold in places like South Africa. And I think this is quite telling, especially if you look at it from this context, and you look again at the last 50 years. And this is part of a paper that we actually published this year in Celebration of South African Botany. And you'll see that there are particular areas, genetic engineering, sustainable agriculture, CRISPR, that's gene editing, that have actually become very important in global biotechnology. And this shows a positive growth of biotechnological activities since the 1970s. And if you look at this, from the mid-90s, where molecular biology really exploded, you see many different subject areas that then became quite important for study. So what does this look like in the context of South African plants? A place that has a large floral kingdom. Again, a positive trajectory in terms of the activities that have been taking place here, but the topics are quite different. Biotechnology, climate change is becoming a massive topic, abiotic stresses, you are getting some genome editing, and some of the plants that are being studied, cassava, crops that are important to Africa, sorghum, and Zea maize, which is interesting because maize is a very much a staple here in South Africa, and you don't see much of those South African plants that I actually showed you earlier on in this presentation. And the topics that people are focusing on happen to be bioinformatics, some genetic engineering, but large amounts of biotechnology in terms of South Africa has focused on using tissue culture and in some cases to actually save South African plants from overexploitation, such as the wild ginger that I indicated is no longer existing in the wild in native areas where that plant is meant to be found. Indigenous knowledge in South Africa is actually regarded as a main driver of the bioeconomy, and it has been included into the bioeconomy by the South African government. At the same time, the latest decadal plan of the Department of Science and Innovation integrates indigenous knowledge systems together with biotechnology because they see these two areas as new ways that will allow us to be able to grow the bioeconomy. And so what does that really mean? It presents with many challenges. And so one needs to actually think about balancing exploitation of indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, medicinal plants, and then also integrating biotechnological strategies. And some of these challenges are linked to the fact that the compounds that give benefit to medicinal plants are highly variable. They're often not found throughout the whole entire year. They can also be limited in terms of where the species are actually growing. And there are other factors that can also cause constraints in terms of the commercialization of medicinal plants. And so we need to be able to develop quality assurance protocols so that we can ultimately commercialize those medicinal plants, such as in the case of Pelargonium pseudoides, which is commercialized as a treatment for colds and flus. And that is actually sold throughout the whole entire world. For South Africans, we often take a product called Lintagon, and that is made out of Pelargonium pseudoides and the tuber of Pelargonium pseudoides. And what's also quite interesting is that there are benefit sharing programs that allow for communities that have held this knowledge in relation to Pelargonium pseudoides to participate in obtaining some financial assistance as well as non-monetary benefits. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to delve a little bit deeper into this ethnobotanical treasure trove, which happens to be the medicinal plants of South Africa. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples from my particular environment that are going to showcase some of these intersections, whether they be from a socio-cultural perspective, from a climate science perspective, and even integrating biotechnological strategies along the way. So walk with me across the Roy Plain. That's what my university looks like, where Yenzi and Werner are likely sitting at this particular time, and walk to my laboratory. And these are some of the members of my lab that have been involved in some of this research, that have participated, and I'm going to share some of their work. So we utilize an integrated approach where I am particularly interested in studying medicinal plants and understanding how they make these very sophisticated, specialized metabolites. And this requires me to be able to understand impacts of stress, and understanding stresses has a direct relationship to changing environments that are going to become much more stressful for plants in the future. We utilize biotechnological strategies such as tissue culture, and sometimes I call this the torture chamber. So we'll take plants from the wild, grow them in tissue culture, and then change the environment and create the stress within the body. And then we use a range of different technologies, metabolomics, genomics, and there's a little bit of drug discovery that actually happens in my particular environment. So the first species I want to bring up is Sciletium tortuosum from the family Azoaceae. This is a succulent. It comes from the succulent Karoo region, and it was first noted to actually have some beneficiation in terms of changing the mood, when Simon van der Stel noted this in his book that he wrote in the 1600s in relation to his travels throughout Namaqualand. And one of the things that he noted was that this had commercial potential, but he saw the local people jumping for joy and being very much excited. And so he always wondered what was going on with Sciletium. So it has been shown that in the past it was used to induce trance-like activities during celebrations by the sun. Okay, so this species is one species that I have been studying, and it is a little bit elusive. It's difficult to see. So whenever we go out into the field and we eventually find it, we explode in celebration. And this became a little bit of a ritual between Helen Reddy and I. Every time we saw Sciletium, we gave a Sciletium jump. And so there were quite a few pictures of us that we collected throughout our travels. But it also meant that we had to interact with the people who knew more about these plants than we did. And so finding these plants meant that we interacted with local people, the Rastafarian community that actually took us into different parts of the Namaqualand in search for Sciletium, as well as other people in the area who had very deep information about Sciletium. And this information was often in relation to where are the plants found, but also how to actually utilize these plants. And so we went to a variety of different areas, and ultimately when we go back to the lab, we try and study all the metabolites that are important in giving this mood alleviating effect of Sciletium. And what was interesting is that we could separate out populations based on elevation. And those that were at high elevation had a different profile of the mesobrine alkaloids that they actually contain in comparison to those that were at low elevation. And what this means from a biosynthesis perspective is that the plants that are actually sitting at low elevation utilize tyrosine, an amino acid, and phenylalanine, another amino acid, to produce these compounds that I'm pointing to here, which are mesomarine alkaloids. And these often occur at low diversity and concentration in those plants that are at low elevation. However, when the plants are at high elevation, they experience ultraviolet stress, they change their metabolism and they produce betalains, and those betalains are the same compounds that are in beetroot, that give beetroot that red color, which act as antioxidants and UV screens. So there's a different metabolism depending on the kind of stress exposure that the plants are being exposed to. And those plants that are at high elevation produce betalains, but at the same time, they also have higher amounts of the mesombrinone and the mesombrin alkaloids. So stress actually elevates production of some of these mesombrin alkaloids. What's quite interesting about these plants is the variability of this chemistry, even in species that are actually found in the same area, where 3 different plants of the Sciletium crassicole, or 4 different plants of the Sciletium crassicole, have very different concentrations of these alkaloids. So this means that if you are intending to commercialize this plant, you actually have to search for the right chemotype, and that information is also somewhat linked to other people. And because of that, then it becomes very important to consider sharing the benefits with the people who have held this knowledge about these plants for a very long time. And in our particular case, this has meant that we have produced a product through our company Fienti. It's a startup of the university, in collaboration with 4 other researchers, and we share our benefits with the SAN Council. We signed a benefit sharing agreement last year, and we are now selling this product, and they are both non-monetary benefits as well as monetary benefits. And I can speak to this a little bit more in relation to the Biodiversity Act, the Nagoya Protocol, and how those different pieces of legislation are supposed to protect local people, to prevent biopiracy. My next example is Lysertia frutescens, or Sutherlandia. In South Africa, this one is called kankerbos or cancer bush, and yes, it does have anti-cancer activity. It's a legume. In this particular context, we've done all kinds of different biotechnological applications where we've made genetically transformed products, but most of our work recently has actually been to study the amino acid profile, the specialized metabolites that these plants have, as well as using a proteomics analysis to study the effects of stress in this particular species. And this, of course, speaks directly to possibilities of climate change and what those changes may actually look like in terms of medicinal plants. Because at the moment, there's very little information that is known in respect to changing climates and impacts on medicinal plants. And that would cause a future issue with 60 to 80% of the South African population that rely on medicinal plants. So in this particular case, we looked at effects of high salinity as well as different nutrient profiles. These are amongst factors that are likely to be affected by climate change. And then we looked at the changes that actually happen inside the cell that relate to the proteins that drive metabolism, as well as the growth and development of these plants. And all of this work was done in a tissue culture system. What's very interesting is that there are many changes. I don't think anybody should be trying to read any of these words, but there are many different changes that actually take place. And when you dissect it and you look deeply in terms of those changes, you find that the plant is changing the way in which it does its sugar metabolism, nitrogen assimilation, even photosynthesis. And all of these processes here that I'm showing here are really central to the existence of the plant, its basic growth and development. At the same time, it reacts by having structural changes, inducing heat shock proteins to cope with the stress, and then it also changes its metabolism. Those soya saponins have that anti-cancer effect, as well as the southerlandiosides are also thought to be responsible for the anti-cancer effect of Sutherlandia. So both primary metabolism as well as specialized metabolism is actually changing. I want to turn now to Aspalathus linearis. This is rooibos, South Africa's most favorite tea. This work was done by Catherine Wilkinson, who recently graduated a PhD. We went out to different parts of the Cederberg and the Northern Cape looking for wild rooibos. And what was very interesting was that the wild rooibos could be separated based on where it actually was found, and also that wild rooibos is genetically distinct. Those chemical differences are very much site-specific, and one problem here is that certain sites have limited gene flow, and this could ultimately lead to a future risk in terms of this biodiversity. And I did this work with Rhoda Malchas, and some of the areas where we were going to, local people were actually showing us where this wild rooibos can actually be found, because they also rely on it as a source of income as well as for its health beneficiation. So it also puts those communities at risk if that biodiversity is ultimately lost. What's quite interesting about rooibos is that most of us are drinking it as a tea. It's got high levels of antioxidants. It's found in a lot of skin products in South Africa. But we were quite interested to see what effects it might possibly have on skin cancer. And so we looked to see what it does to skin cancer, and we took commercial rooibos as well as a wild rooibos ecotype, and we studied these ecotypes against a cancer cell line, and both the commercial rooibos as well as the wild rooibos had anti-cancer activity, and the protein changes that were actually being expressed by the commercial as well as the wild rooibos changes that linked to the death of the cancer are some of those proteins that I'm actually showing in this particular heat map. It's a massive amount of proteins that are changing, and so the effects are really quite complex, but I'm going to summarize them in this particular sketch here. So we think that the wild rooibos actually elicits apoptotic markers. These are markers that ultimately lead to the death of the cancer cell. And also at the same time, it interferes with mitochondrial function, and the mitochondria gives energy to the cancer cell. And so all of these different processes ultimately lead to lowering cell cycle progression, so the way in which the cell is dividing, and at the same time can actually lead ultimately to the death of the cancer cell. And I think it would be interesting to see what kind of product could ultimately come out of that wild rooibos. And then my last example here is linked to Dodonea viscosa, which is a species that's actually found throughout the whole entire world, India, Asia, such as China. Kenya, in other parts of Africa, and even the Americas. And in this particular case, the Cape Bush Doctors Association, together with us, worked on a project where we looked at the anti-cancer effects against breast cancer of this particular plant, which they use in pretty much every herbal mixture that they commercialize. The bush doctors are the main commodifiers of traditional medicines within the Western Cape, and we would thus like to produce a product that can be used as an adjuvant treatment with the Cape Bush doctors as our benefit sharing partners. And another story that I just want to give some hints to, I'm not going to spend too much time here, is linked to Pelargonium species, where we are trying to look for antifungal agents amongst these different plants of pelargoniums. And pelargoniums are generally horticulturally important in South Africa and other parts of the world. And within the bush doctor community, they are also of medicinal importance. So we have developed a protocol that actually allows us to better understand the chemistry of these pelargoniums. They're full of caffeic acids, camphoryls. These are all plants with strong antioxidant effects, and they've also been shown to have antifungal effects against fungi such as Candida, which become really problematic in immunocompromised individuals. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that this talk has given you some insights into the wonderful plants that sit in South Africa, in the ways in which those plants are important to people, and also given you some ideas about the importance of trying to act in a space that may lead to commercial benefit, taking into consideration that the knowledge that is being exploited actually belongs to others. And so social justice needs to be part of the practice in the commercialization of these plants. Something else that I think is of importance is that we have so many different plants in South Africa, so many medicinal plants, but we still have so much that we need to learn about these plants and really better understand their chemical character, especially in the context of a changing climate. And this requires for us to gain deep information about the function of the plants internally in relation to their genetic and biochemical composition. And the 1KSA project is providing some reference information, and this project is aiming to actually sequence over 1,000 genomes across the scale: animals, plants, fungi, and other microbial organisms. And I think the moment we have a Scletium genome, a Sutherlandia genome, a Dodonea genome, this will actually give us better ideas in terms of how these plants are actually reacting to changing climates. And with that, I'd like to thank all of those people that have contributed to this work. And I would like particularly to thank funders as well, and past students and current students who continue to assist in providing new information in relation to medicinal plants of South Africa. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Prof Makunga. I think that was like a combination of a botanical lesson and a little bit of a climate change lesson, a little bit of a medicine lesson, and a little bit of social justice as well. So it is very all-encompassing, which I think is exactly what the chair is about, being very transdisciplinary and also intersecting in terms of all the different ways that we can use our science for servitude. And I think this is one of the best ways that you've done it. I think we have about 7 minutes for questions. If there are any questions, you're welcome to unmute yourself. Otherwise, you can quickly type it into the chat and I can read it to everyone. Francesca, so your hand is raised. You're welcome to unmute.
Yes, thank you very much for really fascinating presentations on many issues concerning these plants and what we don't know and what we know about them. So I had a question, as I know a little bit the same kind of situation in countries like Chile or Latin America. I was wondering whether you have a network with other places in which, you know, plants are used, and also there is a lot of community knowledge about those, and that's the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesca, for that question. So I have quite a broad network. I work with people in different parts of Asia, for example. Obviously, Chinese traditional medicine is massive. So there's some lessons to be learned from that, in terms of the African context. But unfortunately, my South American links are virtually almost non-existent. And this is a pity because there was a potential opportunity for me actually to go to Brazil this past year. It just clashed with something else that was going on at that time. So I couldn't physically be at that networking event. But I am, of course, always willing to build the network. And so if you know any people that might be interested to partner, that would be fantastic.
Thank you, Prof. I'm just going to go to one question that's in the chat and then I'll pass over to Steffi as well. Then maybe we can answer both of the questions. Prof, can I ask that you stop sharing the screen so that we can all see as well? Thank you. So in the chat, a question was asked. Sorry, now I need to find it. Scrolling through a lot. Okay, so how are local communities being impacted by some of these climate changes? And what have you observed in terms of local communities living with the land, and particularly with the changes that are occurring? So that was one question from the chat. And then Steffi also has her hand up and then we can answer after her. Thanks.
I didn't necessarily delve into this piece of research that we did a while back, but this was part of a master's study. And one of the and this was a master study, and particularly focusing on the Cape Bush doctor community, where we interviewed bush doctors and we asked them about, you know, are they seeing impacts related to climate change? Would they consider, you know, growing plants in their gardens, and just generally trying to get an understanding of what they thought was actually happening with climate change. And some of them were very much clear that certain species that they used to be able to find easily, they're finding it more difficult to find those plants. So they are definitely seeing impacts. And that some of the plants are becoming a little bit more unpredictable, especially in terms of how they function in the human body. And I say this especially in the context here in South Africa in 2017, 2018, we had a terrible drought. And this was also part of during the time when we were starting to wrap up this study with the bush doctors. So they were saying things like they feel that sometimes the plants are actually getting stronger, but you can't necessarily predict that strength is going to be something that's going to be maintained. So they are definitely concerned about losing particular species, finding it more difficult to access certain species. We've got to climb higher and higher and higher, you know, to get to certain plants that we used to easily find at different ranges of their distribution. So I think people are definitely aware in the context of medicinal plants, local people are aware that there is a problem. And I'm not really sure how to offer solutions in relation to that. I think maybe the best approach is to gather some kind of information, and you maybe even do studies that just don't necessarily look at single stresses, but a multi-factor study that looks at different stresses, looking at changes in CO2 levels. I mean, this can be quite complicated, but people are definitely aware that something is happening and they're not really sure how they're going to deal with it in the future.
Thank you, Prof. Steffi, you're welcome to also ask a question.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Nox, for this very interesting presentation. And I'm a big lover of rooibos tea. And so I was just wondering if the concentration of these plants, medicinal plants, is already high enough if you use it in tea as infusions to already have some healing impacts.
Yes, definitely, because if you're taking a tea, you probably are drinking it more than once. So, if you keep the bag and you have 3 cups of rooibos, that's already quite a significant amount of antioxidants that you are consuming. We study both aqueous extracts as well as extracts that are made out of alcoholic solutions. And yes, we do study, extracts that are quite highly concentrated. But with something like rooibos, there's absolutely no problems in, drinking it every day, lots of it. I think it's only really good. It's really good for you. And so I wouldn't be too worried about not getting sufficient concentrations of the antioxidants. But there are some other medicinal plants where one needs to take care in terms of the dose, and also other medications that they might be taking along with those medicinal plants. And Sutherlandia or cancer bush is one of those species that can have cytotoxic effects if one is not careful in terms of how often they actually take that particular herbal remedy. It also has been said that it increases the bioavailability of other drugs. So there are some herbal drug interactions that are associated with it.
Thank you.
And thank you so much again, Prof. I think we just on top of the hour, so that was actually good timing. And there are a few more other comments within the comment section again, but we won't get to all of them now. So I'd really like to encourage everyone to please attend next week, Tuesday, during the ICC in Africa Working Group. I think it's an hour earlier from today's session, and Prof Makunga may be there as well to also answer some questions and just further on the discussion on today's topic, which was very, very, very lovely to watch as well. There's such beautiful schematics and drawings, so thank you for sharing those as well. And I think we can all have a skeletal jump to celebrate this beautiful and very well presented presentation. So thank you all again for attending, and thank you so much again to our speaker, Prof Nox. Really, really appreciate you taking the time to do this for us today. And to everyone, thank you so much for your attendance, and we will see you again either next week or next month for our next discussion with Prof. Rhoda Malchus, who also does sort of a similar type of work as Prof. Makunga, but obviously a different perspective. So if you enjoyed this month, you're going to enjoy next month as well. So thank you all again. Bye. Thanks, Prof.
Bye. Thank you so much, everyone.